we're the last ones standing. Out of all the different types of humans that walked this planet during the Ice Age, Homo sapiens is the only survivor, and one of those extinct groups is what scientists generally call Homo neanderthalensis, though there's been this ongoing argument about whether they should actually be classified as a subspecies of us, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. That subspecies classification got coined back in the 1960s, but then it got tossed aside when this new theory came along claiming that modern humans were this completely pure population that evolved in some tiny isolated region, almost like a human Garden of Eden. If these help you sleep or relax, subscribe. Where's everyone at? City and time. Last video had Dublin to Dallas, and I spent too long trying to figure out the time zones. The name Neanderthal itself comes from the Neander Valley, where their fossils were first discovered, but it could have easily gone a different way. They might have been called Homo calpicus, named after this deformed skull, a calvaria that was found in Gibraltar. Or they could have been Homo mustierensis, after the Moustier archaeological site in France. The naming was just a matter of which discovery got the most attention first. Now here's where things get interesting. Some researchers have proposed that modern humans didn't just replace Neanderthals, they interbred with them so extensively that there simply weren't enough pure Neanderthals left to sustain their population. We know from biology that when different species breed, it can produce infertile offspring. Think about mules, the sterile hybrids that come from horses and donkeys. So the question becomes, did interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals create these human mules that couldn't reproduce? This idea of interbreeding has actually been around for more than 100 years. Scientists have been arguing about it since the early 1900s, but in the 1980s, this claim got completely shut down by what's called the Out of Africa theory, which became almost dogmatic in how it was enforced. The original Out of Africa theory was fierce in defending one specific idea, that modern humans were a pure, unmixed population that descended from a small group in Africa and then spread across the world, completely replacing every other human species they encountered. No mixing, no interbreeding, just total replacement. We now understand that the real story is nowhere near that simple. What happened to the Neanderthals is honestly shocking when you look at the timeline. They hit their peak population around 42,000 years ago, and then in less than 1,000 years, they went into rapid decline. By 40,000 years ago, they'd essentially vanished from the archaeological record. This extinction timeline looks almost like a military blitzkrieg where colonizing modern humans armed with advanced long-range projectiles swept through Europe and wiped out the Neanderthal populations. Two things make this particularly stunning. First, the disappearance happened incredibly fast. They went from their demographic peak to complete extinction in roughly 2,000 years. Second, we're talking about Neanderthals in Western Europe going from the absolute height of their population to extinct in just a couple of millennia. This kind of sudden disappearance is unprecedented in human evolutionary history. Before modern humans showed up, Neanderthals were Europe's only human population. They'd been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists have been debating what caused their extinction for decades now, and various hypotheses have been thrown around. Some suggested Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans. Others proposed they couldn't adapt as well or had cultural limitations that put them at a disadvantage. What we know now is that Neanderthals descended from the European branch of the hominin family tree. Their evolution into a distinct population happened over a long period of time in Europe. But despite this long evolutionary process, despite being the sole humans on European territory, they vanished almost instantly when Homo sapiens arrived on the continent. The timing is impossible to ignore. Neanderthals disappeared at exactly the same time that modern humans colonized Europe. Their extinction has been directly linked to the spread of our species. This has sparked this heated scientific debate, with researchers proposing all kinds of different hypotheses to explain what happened. Researchers generally agree that Neanderthal populations were small, but getting a precise, accurate count is incredibly difficult. Scientists have used demographic modeling to try to estimate their numbers. These models suggest that the entire Neanderthal population across their whole range probably maxed out at around 70,000 individuals. That's not a lot when you're spread across Europe and parts of Asia. Without actual demographic data from fossil populations, scientists had to get creative. They used demographic models to figure out what values of different population parameters could have maintained a stable Neanderthal population. Birth rates, death rates, survival rates at different ages, all of these factors needed to balance out for the population to stay steady. Then in a second step, researchers altered these values to figure out exactly what kind of demographic changes would have led Neanderthals to extinction. They tested different timeframes: 10,000 years, 6,000 years, and 4,000 years. All of these fall within what we know about when modern humans were in Europe, so they're plausible scenarios. Scientists also looked at how reduced survival rates in different age groups would affect extinction probability. They started by modeling what would happen if fewer young children survived. Then they examined two catastrophic scenarios. One was an epidemic that would have killed off adult individuals. The other was a warfare scenario that would have done the same thing. Through all this demographic modelling and simulation work, researchers were trying to identify which demographic parameters were plausible for Neanderthal populations and under what circumstances these parameters could have led to their disappearance. And here's something remarkable that came out of this research. A slight but continuous decrease in fertility, just 4% among younger Neanderthal females, could have had a massive impact on population dynamics. That small change could have been enough to precipitate their demise. This finding opened up a whole new way of thinking about Neanderthal extinction. Maybe it wasn't some catastrophic event, maybe it was something more subtle, more gradual. Nevertheless, while the studies focused on female fertility, the disappearance could also be linked to male fertility issues. If Neanderthal men were being lost in significant numbers due to conflicts between groups or hunting accidents, that would have been hugely important for their physical condition, and therefore for female Neanderthal fertility as well. The reproductive decline of Neanderthals could have been amplified by the arrival of Homo sapiens. We know from both anthropological and genetic evidence that Neanderthals and modern humans experienced some level of hybridization. This happened in Central Asia, in Western Siberia, and on the European continent. This hybridization was actually important for Homo sapiens. It allowed the introgression of several useful genes into the modern human population, especially genes related to pigmentation and metabolism in cold climates. But here's the thing, this mixing involved only a very small number of individuals. We're talking about possibly just 1,000 to 2,000 people total. Genetic comparisons of the Y chromosome between modern humans and Neanderthals suggest something fascinating. Some mutations present in Neanderthals could have caused infertility problems, specifically in male hybrids. These male hybrids, like mules with reduced fertility, may have contributed to an overall decrease in the fertility rate within Neanderthal populations. The Homo sapiens population, on the other hand, had much larger numbers. Even if they experienced some fertility issues from hybridization, their population size meant they could bounce back within a few hundred years. The Neanderthals didn't have that demographic cushion. So if male hybrids between Neanderthals and modern humans were indeed infertile, that would mean only hybrid females passed on Neanderthal genes to later generations. This is actually a key implication tied to something we observe in modern humans. There's an absence of Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA in living people today. The Y chromosome gets inherited paternally from father to son. It doesn't recombine with other chromosomes except in these tiny regions called pseudo-autosomal regions. The fact that Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA is completely absent in modern humans suggests either that male hybrids were infertile or that there was incredibly strong selection against Neanderthal Y chromosomes. Studies have found that the Neanderthal Y chromosome differs from modern human Y chromosomes at some key locations. The research suggests that Neanderthal Y chromosomes carried mutations that were incompatible with modern human genes on other chromosomes, what we call autosomal genes. This incompatibility would have caused either sterility or immune rejection in male hybrids. Female hybrids who were fertile could pass on autosomal Neanderthal DNA to their children, but male hybrids couldn't reproduce, which would have purged the Neanderthal Y chromosome from the gene pool over time. The evidence points to Neanderthal and modern human hybrids producing viable, fertile females but infertile males. This pattern mirrors exactly what we see with mule sterility. Picture a world where all male hybrids born from Neanderthal fathers and modern human mothers were infertile, just like mules. Any male child born from this kind of pairing couldn't have offspring of his own. Female hybrids, though, might have stayed fertile. The social implications of this would have been enormous. This could have led to serious tension and avoidance between modern human and Neanderthal groups. Modern human tribes might have started seeing Neanderthals as a threat to their demographic future. They might have banned interbreeding entirely or isolated hybrid males who couldn't contribute to the next generation. Cultural divides could have formed with stories and taboos against mixing that shaped group identity and survival strategies across Ice Age Europe. If only the male hybrids were infertile, while female hybrids remained fertile, those females could still have children with either modern humans or Neanderthals. This would have dramatically shifted social dynamics. Female hybrids would have been valuable for reproduction, but male hybrids would have been seen as outcasts or burdens on their communities. Modern human groups might have prioritized fertile males for mating, whether those were their own men or any fertile hybrids. Female hybrids could have acted as bridges between populations, increasing genetic diversity, but also complicating political alliances. Families with infertile male hybrids might have faced stigma or social strain since these males couldn't produce heirs or help the tribe grow. This situation could have pushed societies toward matrilineal structures where women's fertility became central to social organization, or it might have led to communities abandoning hybrid males entirely, which would have impacted community cohesion and care systems. Infertile male hybrids might have still made contributions to culture even if they couldn't pass on their genes. They could have taught tool-making techniques, fire-making skills, or hunting strategies they'd learned from their Neanderthal parents. Cultural knowledge doesn't require genetic transmission, but the lack of genetic legacy from these males would have reduced the long-term Neanderthal influence on modern human populations. Traits like certain aspects of height or specific immune system adaptations might have been limited in how much they could spread. Socially, modern humans might have adopted Neanderthal technologies and techniques while actively rejecting interbreeding. This would have slowed down genetic mixing while preserving cultural boundaries between the groups. If Neanderthal males who fathered hybrid children consistently produced infertile sons, Neanderthal populations would have faced extinction much faster than through competition alone. Modern human females who mated with Neanderthal men might have produced fertile daughters but infertile sons. This would have drained Neanderthal reproductive potential, even as it contributed to modern human genetic diversity. This mechanism could explain why Neanderthals disappeared by around 40,000 years ago. Their genes flowed into modern human populations through female hybrids, but their own population numbers kept dwindling. Over generations, modern human groups might have developed strict mating rules specifically to avoid the infertility problem. Favoring in-group reproduction would have led to more isolated, more genetically homogeneous societies, but this isolation would also have meant slower genetic adaptation to the challenges of Ice Age environments. Alternatively, if female hybrids stayed fertile, Neanderthal DNA could persist through them. But male infertility would still delay overall population growth, which would have impacted survival in harsh climates. Infertile males could still participate in relationships and form bonds with modern human or Neanderthal females even if they couldn't father children. This might have led to them being valued for companionship, for protection, or for cultural exchange, teaching tools and hunting skills rather than contributing through reproduction. But their infertility could also create serious tension. Modern human tribes might have seen infertile hybrid males as less valuable or actively excluded them from mating opportunities. Neanderthal groups might have viewed them as inferior members of their communities. Tribes might have created myths or taboos specifically about hybrid males, labeling them as barren warriors or assigning them to non-reproductive roles as a way of preserving their social value despite their infertility. In many hunter-gatherer societies, the chief or leader fathers children with multiple women, so in tribes with more open attitudes toward relationships and reproduction, male infertility might not have been such a major problem. This could have maintained genetic exchange through fertile female hybrids while avoiding some of the social tensions. But it might have also confused lineage tracking and inheritance systems, leading communities to develop new social rules about paternity and kinship. Over time, tribes might have started avoiding mating with Neanderthals specifically to ensure they'd have fertile offspring. Neanderthals were already in demographic decline by 41,000 years ago. If modern humans started avoiding their males due to the infertility risk, that would have reduced mating opportunities even further for an already dwindling population. If infertile hybrid males still married or partnered with Neanderthal females, it could have maintained social ties between the groups without creating genetic legacy. This would have hastened Neanderthal extinction as their numbers dropped without producing new offspring to replace losses. There's this study titled A Critical Review of the Middle Paleolithic in Western Central Europe from its beginnings to its rapid decline that found Neanderthals completely disappeared just 3,000 years after their population peaked in Western Central Europe. According to this research, as Homo sapiens advanced from the south, Neanderthals appear to have taken refuge in northern Germany, specifically along the Eiler and Weser rivers on the North German plains, before they rapidly went extinct there as well. Classic Neanderthal populations lived during what's called the Middle Paleolithic or Middle Old Stone Age. This period covers roughly 200,000 to 40,000 years ago. More than half of all known Neanderthal settlement sites in Germany can be dated to the Middle Paleolithic. More precisely, these sites date back 60,000 to 43,000 years before our time, so the Neanderthal population peak seems to fall right in this period. The number of archaeological sites, their detailed analysis, and the analysis of artifacts found at these settlements all indicate that the Neanderthal population in Germany went through extreme demographic fluctuations. During the Middle Paleolithic, there appear to have been several waves of migration, periods of population increase and decline, localized extinctions in certain areas, and then new settlers returning to those same areas later. Here's what makes this so striking. For the time period between 110,000 and 70,000 years ago, there are only 4 known Neanderthal settlement sites in Germany, 4 sites across 40,000 years. But then in the following period, from 70,000 to 43,000 years ago, there are 94 sites. That's a massive increase in just 27,000 years. What's even more telling is that these 94 sites are mostly clustered in one specific region in the far north of Germany. This type of population density is completely unknown in earlier Neanderthal archaeological records. One possibility that makes a lot of sense is that Neanderthals were being forced out of southern Europe by advancing modern human populations. The survivors took refuge in northern Germany during this final period of their existence. Another study, this one titled "Was Demographic Weakness the Cause of Neanderthal Demise?", investigated Neanderthal disappearance by examining exactly how much demographic change would have been needed over a 10,000-year period to lead to their extinction. When dealing with fossil populations like this, researchers have to infer demographic parameters from present-day and past hunter-gatherer populations and from general bioanthropological principles. According to the most commonly accepted hypothesis coming out of this research, Neanderthals would have been competing with Homo sapiens for food resources. The replacement of Neanderthals would have been favored by several factors. Homo sapiens had greater technical skills and greater cognitive abilities. Neanderthals had a narrower diet and lower social capacities with smaller social networks. The question of what killed off the Neanderthals is honestly one of the greatest scientific mysteries of our time. Our evolutionary cousins vanished almost without leaving a trace around 40,000 years ago, and scientists still can't agree on what doomed them to the abyss of history. It's still not entirely clear why the species went extinct. Was it because of the evolution and expansion of Homo sapiens? Is it just a coincidence that modern humans arrived in Europe right at the height of Neanderthal population and that our evolutionary cousins soon fell into a sudden terminal decline? Probably not a coincidence at all, but this question is going to keep scientists busy for decades to come. There's still so much we don't understand. The replacement theory itself emerged in a specific scientific and cultural context. This context often sought to elevate a single superior origin story for modern humans. The theory reflected biases that were prevalent in 20th century anthropology. By emphasizing a single African origin followed by complete replacement of all other human groups, the theory implicitly framed Eurasian populations as evolutionary dead ends. Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia were portrayed as inferior to successful Homo sapiens. This narrative aligns pretty closely with colonial-era ideas about progress and superiority. One group is seen as inherently better, destined to dominate and erase all the others. This narrative mirrors historical ideologies that prized purity and viewed hybridization or mixing as somehow degenerative. By denying that interbreeding happened, the replacement model rejected the possibility that modern humans could be a product of diverse genetic contributions from multiple populations. Instead, it framed Homo sapiens as this singular, untainted lineage. This approach prioritized a monolithic origin over a more inclusive, hybridized understanding of human ancestry. The theory's inability to adapt when genetic evidence of interbreeding emerged really highlights its limitations. The initial rejection of interbreeding evidence delayed a more accurate understanding of human evolution. It perpetuated this simplistic and exclusionary view of human origins that completely ignored the actual diversity of our ancestry. Either way, Europe belonged to Homo sapiens by 40,000 years ago. The light of Neanderthal populations was enigmatically extinguished. But here's the fundamental question that still divides researchers. Were Neanderthals really a completely separate species that was driven to extinction? Or were they just a unique population of Homo sapiens that got assimilated into the modern population? The classic biological definition of what makes a species hinges on the ability of two groups to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. If they can do that, they're considered the same species by this definition. Yet research papers argue that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, which is what we call early modern Homo sapiens in Europe, were separate species. These arguments cite differences in physical traits, differences in behaviors, and different evolutionary paths. But is this separation actually justified, or does it oversimplify a much more complex, interconnected reality? One of the most compelling pieces of evidence that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons belong to the same species is their demonstrated ability to interbreed. Genetic studies have shown that when these two groups met around 50,000 years ago, they didn't just coexist in the same regions, they mixed genetically. Modern non-African humans carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's a direct legacy of this intermingling. If two groups can produce viable, fertile offspring, which this genetic legacy clearly suggests they could, doesn't that align them as the same species under the biological species concept? Papers arguing for separation claim that morphological differences, like Neanderthals' more robust builds and distinct skull shapes, outweigh this genetic overlap. But is physical appearance alone really enough to draw such a hard line between populations? Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons shared a relatively recent common ancestor. Their interbreeding produced children who in turn had their own offspring. This fertility across multiple generations is a hallmark characteristic of a single species. So why do some researchers insist on keeping them separate? It's complicated, and it gets at some deep questions about how we define species in the first place. Beyond genetics, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons also shared a lot of cultural and technological practices. This further blurs the lines between them. Archaeological evidence shows that both groups used similar stone tools. Both groups buried their dead. Both even created what we'd recognize as art. Cro-Magnons are famous for their cave paintings in places like Lascaux and Chauvet, but Neanderthals also left behind symbolic objects, eagle talons arranged deliberately as jewelry, pigments that might have been used for body decoration. If these two groups were engaging in comparable symbolic behaviors, doesn't that suggest they shared a cognitive and social framework? The argument for separate species counters that these similarities are just superficial parallels, not evidence of deep connection. But isn't the ability to communicate, to cooperate, and to innovate in similar ways a deeper indicator of species unity than skull shape? Think about it for a second. If two groups can understand and mimic each other's behaviors, participate in similar cultural practices, aren't they fundamentally part of the same cultural and biological continuum? Papers emphasizing speciation complexity tend to overlook this behavioral and cultural overlap. They focus instead on differences in average brain size or specific cranial features. But does a slightly different skull shape really justify calling two populations separate species, especially when their lives were so deeply intertwined? This raises a question that gets to the heart of paleoanthropology. Are we letting fossil morphology dictate our conclusions more than we should? There's this article from the British Natural History Museum written by Chris Stringer. It's titled, "Are Neanderthals the Same Species as Us?" Stringer asks about the archaeological evidence that's commonly cited in favour of grouping Neanderthals with us as Homo sapiens. Evidence, like the fact that they had cultural behaviours such as burying their dead and painting designs on cave walls. Stringer's position is interesting as that is, behavioural evidence should be excluded from biological species classification. His reasoning is that behaviours are potentially more plastic than anatomical or genetic traits. They evolve more quickly. They spread more easily within and between species. Plus, demonstrating that a past human species had a particular behaviour is sometimes difficult to establish convincingly from the archaeological record alone. It's worth taking a really deep dive into this point because it hinges on dismissing behavioural evidence like burial practices and cave art as irrelevant and unreliable for classifying Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. While it's easy to understand the concern about the plasticity of behaviour and the difficulty of interpreting it from ancient remains, suggesting that it's unreasonable to consider behavioural evidence at all seems like a stretch. Behaviours aren't just random noise in the data, they can offer critical insights into the cognitive and social capacities of these groups, and those capacities are deeply tied to biological identity. Many researchers push back against this dismissal. They argue that ignoring behavioural evidence isn't just short-sighted, it actually undermines a holistic understanding of what species classification should be based on. The Natural History Museum's position claims that behaviours like burying the dead and painting on cave walls are irrelevant to species classification because they're potentially more plastic, they evolve more quickly, and they spread more easily than anatomical or DNA-based traits. Also, that they're hard to establish reliably from archaeological evidence. But isn't it kind of absurd to throw out such rich evidence simply because it's complex? Behaviours aren't just side notes in human evolution, they're windows directly into the minds, the cultures, and the evolutionary pressures that shaped both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. To dismiss them as unreliable or secondary evidence is to ignore half the story of what actually makes a species a species. Let's tackle the plasticity argument first. Sure, behaviours can change relatively fast and spread through cultural exchange between groups, but that's precisely why they matter so much. If both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons engaged in symbolic behaviours like burial rituals and creating art, doesn't that suggest a shared underlying cognitive capacity? And isn't that capacity as fundamental to their identity as their bone structure? The ability to create meaning, to mourn the dead, to express creativity through art, these aren't superficial add-ons to what makes us human. They're hallmarks of advanced hominin evolution. These capacities are likely rooted directly in shared biology, in brain structure and neural organization. To say this is irrelevant because it's plastic is like saying language doesn't matter when studying humans because accents and dialects can change. That's ridiculous, right? Now, let's address the difficulty of establishing these behaviours from the archaeological record. Yes, it's tricky. Cave paintings can degrade over tens of thousands of years. Burial sites can be disturbed or misinterpreted, but the exact same criticisms can be levelled at fossils and DNA evidence. Fossils are rare. They're often fragmentary. They're subject to all kinds of speculation about how we should interpret them. DNA can be contaminated. Ancient DNA can be incomplete or degraded. Yet we don't dismiss fossil or genetic evidence entirely just because it has limitations. Why should behavioural evidence be held to a higher standard of proof than other types of evidence? The evidence we do have is actually pretty striking. Neanderthal burials with grave goods placed intentionally with the bodies, pigments found at Neanderthal sites that have no practical use except for decoration, Neanderthal cave art that overlaps in time and geographic space with Cro-Magnon cave paintings. All of this shows remarkable parallels between the groups. To wave all that off as too hard to pin down definitively is to miss the forest for the trees. And here's the real kicker about this whole debate. Behaviours aren't somehow isolated from anatomy and DNA. They're direct products of the brain, which is itself obviously a biological trait. If Neanderthals had the neural wiring necessary to bury their dead or create symbolic art, that capacity is as much a part of their species definition as their distinctive skull shape. The Natural History Museum approach leans heavily on anatomical and genetic data to define species boundaries, but it's actually laughable to think we can fully understand speciation without considering how these populations thought and acted. Species aren't just collections of bones and DNA sequences. They're living, breathing entities with minds. Behaviours give us a direct glimpse into those minds and how they worked. The suggestion that behavioural evidence is fundamentally irrelevant doesn't hold up under serious scrutiny. It's not ridiculous to look at all available evidence when trying to understand extinct populations. What's ridiculous is arbitrarily excluding an entire category of data just because that data is messy or complicated to interpret. Science thrives on wrestling with complexity, not on oversimplification. The archaeological record might be imperfect, but it's our best tool for understanding what life was actually like in the past. To say we should ignore behaviours because they're hard to interpret conclusively is like saying we should ignore weather forecasts because some measurements have uncertainty in them. It's a cop-out, not a reasoned scientific stance. The focus on anatomical and genetic separation might itself be fundamentally flawed if it overlooks how behaviours reflect underlying biological similarities. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons shared the brain capacity for symbolic art and complex ritual behaviours, their biology was clearly compatible enough to warrant classification as members of the same species. In short, dismissing behavioural evidence as irrelevant and unreliable is not only short-sighted from a scientific perspective, it's downright absurd when you think about what we're actually trying to understand. Behaviours like burial practices and artistic creation aren't distracting details. They're essential pieces of the puzzle. They show that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were far more alike than they were different. They were likely part of the same species, Homo sapiens. The Natural History Museum might want to prioritise anatomy and DNA in their classification systems, but to ignore how these groups actually lived, how they thought, how they interacted with each other and their environment, that's to miss the full scope of their humanity. In fact, the 2% Neanderthal DNA present in modern humans today isn't just about genes being passed down. It's about the legacy of their shared ways of life, too. So the next time someone claims that behaviors don't matter in species classification, ask yourself this question. If we can't learn anything meaningful from how our ancestors actually acted and lived, what exactly are we even studying? The richness of their lives, their creativity, their burial rituals, their social connections, all of that deserves a place at the table in these discussions. It doesn't deserve a dismissive shrug. It's not ridiculous to include behavioral evidence in species classification. What's ridiculous is pretending we can understand what species these populations belong to without examining how they lived. Genetically, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were remarkably similar to each other. Their genomes differ by less than 0.1%. That's a minuscule gap when you compare it to the differences between, say, modern humans and chimpanzees. This genetic closeness suggests they weren't only capable of interbreeding successfully, it suggests they were part of what's essentially a continuous gene pool. The Natural History Museum and similar institutions point to specific genetic markers or particular fossil features to argue for maintaining separation between the groups, but these markers could just as easily represent regional variations, sort of like different dialects within the same language. If we accept that small genetic differences within a species don't create new species, and we do accept that for modern human populations, why should we treat the differences between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons as some kind of exception to this rule? The presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern human populations isn't just a historical footnote or a curiosity, it's a living testament to their shared species status. Every single time someone with European or Asian ancestry inherits a snippet of Neanderthal DNA from their parents, they're carrying forward a direct legacy of what some call interspecies mingling, but what might more accurately be called intraspecies gene flow. Doesn't this genetic continuity fundamentally undermine the idea of rigid species boundaries between these populations? Papers focusing on speciation complexity might be missing the forest for the trees here. They're prioritizing theoretical models of how speciation should work over the actual empirical data about how these populations interacted and exchanged genes. The evidence of successful interbreeding, the evidence of shared cultural practices, the evidence of genetic similarity, all of this points in one direction. The morphological differences that get emphasized in arguments for separation are real. Neanderthals did have more robust skeletons on average. They did have different skull shapes with features like prominent brow ridges and a different cranial vault shape. But morphological variation exists within species. We see it in modern humans across different geographic regions. We see it in other species that have wide geographic ranges. The question isn't whether Neanderthals looked different from Cro-Magnons. They clearly did. The question is whether those differences are significant enough to outweigh all the evidence for biological continuity, the evidence for successful reproduction, the evidence for shared cognitive capacities, the evidence for cultural exchange. When you lay out all the evidence together, the case for keeping Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons in separate species becomes much weaker. It starts to look like a classification system that's being maintained more out of historical inertia than because of compelling biological reasoning. The original classifications were made before we had genetic evidence, before we fully understood the extent of interbreeding, before we appreciated how similar their cultural behaviors were. Now that we have all this additional evidence, maybe it's time to seriously reconsider whether the species boundary we've drawn actually reflects biological reality, or whether it's an artifact of how paleontology developed as a field when it was more focused on cataloguing morphological differences than on understanding population dynamics and gene flow. The argument about behavioral plasticity deserves even more scrutiny than it usually gets. Yes, behaviors can change relatively quickly compared to skeletal morphology. Cultural practices can spread between groups through learning and imitation without requiring any genetic change at all. But this plasticity doesn't make behaviors irrelevant to understanding species relationships. If anything, it makes them more interesting and more informative. When we see two populations engaging in the same complex behaviors, particularly behaviors that require sophisticated cognitive abilities, that tells us something important about their underlying biology. It tells us their brains were wired in fundamentally similar ways. The capacity for symbolic thought, for planning burials, for creating representational art, these aren't trivial abilities that pop up randomly. These are sophisticated cognitive functions that depend on specific neural architecture. If both Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons had this architecture, that's powerful evidence of biological similarity. The fact that behaviors can spread through cultural transmission doesn't negate this. It actually reinforces it because successful cultural transmission between groups requires compatible cognitive systems. Think about what's required for one population to learn complex behaviors from another population. They need to be able to observe and understand what the other group is doing. They need to grasp the purpose and meaning behind the behaviors. They need to be able to replicate the behaviors themselves. This kind of cross-cultural learning requires a shared cognitive foundation. If Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were truly as different as separate species are supposed to be, we wouldn't expect to see this kind of behavioral convergence or cultural exchange. We'd expect to see more fundamental differences in how they interacted with their world. The archaeological evidence doesn't show that kind of fundamental difference. Now let's talk about the claim that behavioral evidence is hard to establish from the archaeological record. This is true, but it's being used selectively to dismiss evidence that doesn't fit a preferred narrative. All paleontological and archaeological evidence comes with interpretive challenges. Fossil bones can be damaged, scattered, or altered by geological processes. We make inferences about how extinct animals moved and behaved based on fragmentary skeletal remains. With ancient DNA, we're working with degraded genetic material that's often contaminated with modern DNA or environmental DNA. We use sophisticated statistical methods to try to separate signal from noise, but there's always uncertainty. Yet we don't throw out fossil evidence or genetic evidence just because it requires careful interpretation. The same standard should apply to behavioral evidence. Yes, we have to be careful about how we interpret ancient burials. Yes, we need to rule out natural processes that might create patterns that look intentional. But when we find Neanderthal burials with bodies in deliberate positions, with stone tools and animal bones placed alongside them, with evidence of the grave being dug and then filled in, we can make reasonable inferences. These aren't wild speculations, they're evidence-based conclusions using the same kind of reasoning we apply to other aspects of the archaeological record. The evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior has actually gotten stronger over time as more sites have been discovered and analyzed with better methods. We're not talking about one or two ambiguous cases, we're talking about multiple independent lines of evidence from different sites across their geographic range. Neanderthal cave art in Spain dated to before modern humans arrived in the region. Pigments and shells modified for use as jewellery or decoration, patterns carved into bones, eagle talons with modifications that suggest they were strung together as a necklace. Each piece of evidence can be questioned in isolation, sure, but when you look at the full body of evidence together, a clear picture emerges. Neanderthals were engaging in symbolic behavior. They were creating and using symbols in ways that required abstract thought and cultural transmission. This is exactly the kind of behavior we associate with modern human cognition. If Neanderthals had these cognitive abilities, what does that tell us about how different they really were from Cro-Magnons? The dismissal of behavioral evidence seems to rest on a kind of circular reasoning. The argument goes that Neanderthals were a separate species, therefore we should focus on anatomical differences and downplay behavioral similarities. But shouldn't we be using all available evidence, including behavioral evidence, to figure out whether they were actually a separate species in the first place? By deciding in advance that behavioral evidence doesn't count, we're stacking the deck in favour of separation. We're ignoring evidence that might lead us to a different conclusion. That's not good science. Good science means considering all the evidence and following where it leads, even if that means revising long-held classifications. The point about behaviours being products of the brain really can't be emphasised enough. The brain is an organ, it's a biological structure, its capabilities are constrained by its anatomy and physiology. If two populations have brains that can produce the same complex behaviours, that tells us their brain biology was fundamentally similar. You can't have symbolic art without the neural circuitry for symbolic representation. You can't have intentional burial with grave goods without the cognitive capacity for planning, for understanding death as a concept, for caring about what happens to bodies after death. These aren't simple behaviours. They're windows into sophisticated cognitive processing. The Natural History Museum's position essentially asks us to ignore this window into cognition. It asks us to focus purely on skull measurements and DNA sequences while pretending that what these populations actually did with their brains doesn't matter for classification. That's an impoverished view of what constitutes biological identity. Species aren't just defined by their morphology and genetics in some abstract sense. They're defined by how they live, how they interact with their environment, how they organize socially. Behavioral ecology is a core part of understanding what makes a species what it is. To exclude it from discussions of extinct human populations is to miss crucial information. Moreover, the archaeological record might be imperfect, but it's not useless. We've gotten very good at extracting reliable information from it. Taphonomy, the study of what happens to remains after death, helps us distinguish intentional human behaviour from natural processes. Use wear analysis on stone tools tells us how they were used. Residue analysis can reveal what materials were being processed. Chemical analysis of pigments tells us about resource procurement and possibly about symbolic systems. Site formation processes are now well understood, helping us recognize when spatial patterns of artifacts reflect actual human behavior versus natural sorting. We have whole suites of analytical methods that let us make robust inferences about ancient behavior. To say we should ignore all this because interpretation is difficult is to ignore decades of methodological advances in archaeology and related fields. It's like saying we should stop using microscopes because they require skill to operate and interpretation to understand what we're seeing. The difficulty of interpretation doesn't negate the value of the evidence. The evidence we do have about Neanderthal behaviour is actually pretty unambiguous in many cases. Neanderthal burials show clear patterns that distinguish them from natural processes. Bodies are found in positions that don't occur naturally. They're found in specially dug pits. They're sometimes found with objects that had to be deliberately placed. Some sites show evidence that the burial pit was dug, the body placed inside, and then the pit filled in. These aren't patterns that happen by chance. These are intentional actions that required planning and effort. They reflect cognitive abilities and possibly emotional or spiritual beliefs about death. The pigments found at Neanderthal sites are similarly telling. These aren't just rocks that happen to be colourful lying around naturally. These are materials that were specifically collected, sometimes transported from distant sources, and then processed for use. In some cases, we can see that they were ground into powder. Sometimes they show mixing with other materials. What were Neanderthals using these pigments for? We can't know with absolute certainty, but the most parsimonious explanation is decoration of some kind. Body painting, perhaps, or marking of objects or surfaces. These uses all imply symbolic thought, the use of colour to convey meaning or to create aesthetic effects. The modified eagle talons found at some Neanderthal sites are even more striking. Eagles aren't easy prey. Hunting them or scavenging them requires effort, but Neanderthals weren't using eagle talons for food. They were selecting talons specifically, modifying them in consistent ways that suggest they were being prepared for stringing together and presumably wearing them as some kind of personal ornamentation. This is sophisticated behaviour. It requires not just the technical skill to modify the talons, but also the cognitive capacity for personal adornment, for using objects to make statements about identity or status or group membership. This is the kind of symbolic behaviour that's deeply tied to human cognition and social organisation. When you add up all this behavioural evidence, burial practices, use of pigments, personal ornamentation, symbolic markings on objects, it paints a picture of a population that was cognitively sophisticated, a population that had symbolic thought, that had culture in the sense of learned behaviours transmitted across generations, that had social complexity. These aren't peripheral details about Neanderthals. These are central features of who they were as a population. To classify them as a separate species while ignoring all this evidence about their cognitive and cultural capacities seems backwards. Classification should be based on understanding the full biological reality of these populations, not just on measuring skull dimensions. The comparison to modern human variation is worth dwelling on. Modern humans show substantial morphological variation across geographic populations. Skull shapes, body proportions, skeletal robustness, all of these vary. We don't classify these variations as separate species because we recognize they're all part of normal variation within Homo sapiens. The morphological differences between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons are larger than differences between modern human populations, yes, but they're not categorically different in kind. They're differences of degree, and when you add in the evidence of interbreeding producing fertile offspring, the evidence of shared cultural practices, the evidence of genetic similarity, the case for separate species becomes very weak. It starts to look like we're maintaining a classification based on outdated assumptions rather than on current evidence. The assumption was that Neanderthals were this primitive, extinct side branch of the human family tree, but the evidence shows they were sophisticated, successful, and genetically compatible with early modern humans. Maybe the real issue is that our species concepts don't work very well for populations that are in the process of diverging or that have diverged but can still interbreed. The biological species concept, with its focus on reproductive isolation, doesn't handle these intermediate cases well. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons might represent populations that had diverged enough to develop distinct morphologies, but not enough to become reproductively incompatible. In cases like this, forcing populations into rigid species categories might actually obscure biological reality rather than clarifying it. We might be better served by recognizing that speciation is a process, not a binary state. Populations can be somewhere along the continuum between being fully part of the same species and being completely separate species. The archaeological evidence from specific sites really drives home how sophisticated Neanderthal behaviour was. Take the burial site at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. This site was excavated in the early 1900s, and it showed clear evidence of intentional burial. The Neanderthal individual was placed in a deliberately dug pit. The position of the skeleton and the surrounding deposits indicate this wasn't a natural process. More recent excavations and analyses of Neanderthal burial sites have strengthened this interpretation. Sites across Europe and the Middle East show patterns consistent with intentional burial. Bodies in specific positions, sometimes in flexed postures that don't occur naturally. Burial pits that were dug and then filled in. Evidence that rocks or other objects were placed with the bodies. Some researchers have argued that some of these burials might just be bodies that were disposed of to avoid attracting scavengers rather than true burials with symbolic meaning. But even if we accept that more skeptical interpretation for some sites, it still requires acknowledging that Neanderthals understood death as a concept, planned their actions around dealing with dead bodies, and coordinated group efforts to dig pits and move bodies. These aren't simple behaviours, they require cognitive abilities like planning, cooperation, and understanding of cause and effect relationships, and many burial sites show features that go beyond simple disposal. Objects placed with bodies, careful positioning, selection of specific locations. These features suggest symbolic or ritual aspects to the burials. The cave art evidence is particularly compelling because it's dated to before modern humans arrived in the regions where it's found. In caves in Spain, researchers have found paintings and engravings that date to more than 64,000 years ago. This is thousands of years before modern humans reached that part of Europe. The art includes geometric shapes, hand stencils, and representations that might be animals or other objects. The techniques used, applying pigment to cave walls, creating hand stencils by blowing pigment around placed hands, these require planning and technical skill. They also require the cognitive capacity for symbolic representation. Why would Neanderthals paint on cave walls unless they had some kind of symbolic system, some way of encoding meaning in visual representations? The location of some of this art, deep in caves that would have required deliberate journeys into dark spaces, suggests it had special significance. This wasn't casual doodling, it was intentional creation of symbolic images in specific locations. The pigment use at Neanderthal sites extends beyond cave art. Archaeological sites across their range show evidence of pigment procurement and processing. Red and yellow ochres, manganese dioxide for black pigments, these materials were being collected and prepared for use. In some cases, we can see that different pigments were being mixed together or that binders were being added to create more usable paints. The effort involved in this is substantial. Sources of good pigment materials might be kilometres away from living sites. The materials had to be recognised as useful, collected, transported back to camp, and then processed. Grinding stones with pigment residues show that systematic preparation was happening. This isn't accidental or casual behaviour. Personal ornamentation provides another line of evidence for symbolic behaviour. The eagle talon necklaces are the most striking examples, but they're not the only ones. Perforated shells that could have been strung together have been found at Neanderthal sites. Some shells had to be transported from coastal areas into the interior, showing these weren't just opportunistic uses of local materials. The perforations in these shells are deliberately made. They're positioned consistently in ways that would allow the shells to hang properly when strung. The wear patterns on the perforations suggest they were actually worn, not just modified and then discarded. Someone was making these objects and someone was wearing them. What's the function of personal ornamentation? It's fundamentally symbolic. It's about using objects to communicate something about identity, status, group membership, or aesthetic preferences. This kind of symbolic communication requires cognitive abilities that we associate specifically with human intelligence. The evidence for Neanderthal symbolic markings on objects adds another dimension. Bones with regular incisions, patterns that are too regular to be butchery marks or natural damage. These markings show intentional creation of patterns, possibly for symbolic or decorative purposes. Some researchers interpret these as early forms of record-keeping or calendrical notation. Whether that specific interpretation is correct or not, the markings themselves demonstrate planning and execution of deliberate patterns. This is abstract thought made visible. It's cognitive processing that goes beyond immediate practical needs to create something that exists purely as information or symbol. All of this behavioral evidence creates problems for the view that Neanderthals were cognitively or culturally inferior to modern humans. If they had burials, art, ornamentation, and symbolic markings, how exactly were they inferior? The differences in material culture between Neanderthals and early modern humans in Europe are actually pretty subtle in many ways. Both groups made sophisticated stone tools using similar techniques. Both groups hunted large game effectively. Both groups used fire, constructed shelters, and presumably had complex social organization needed to coordinate these activities. The stone tool technologies evolved in parallel ways in both populations, suggesting similar cognitive approaches to solving technical problems. Where we do see differences in material culture, they often look more like stylistic variations than fundamental differences in capability. Different preferred stone types, different specific tool forms, different artistic styles. These are the kinds of variations we'd expect to see between different cultural groups, not necessarily between different species with different cognitive capacities. The genetic evidence of interbreeding really should be the decisive factor in this debate. When two populations can interbreed and produce fertile offspring over multiple generations, that's the classic definition of belonging to the same biological species. The genetic data shows clearly that this happened with Neanderthals and early modern humans. The 2% Neanderthal DNA in modern non-African populations didn't get there by accident. It got there through interbreeding that produced viable children who themselves had children. Multiple generations of gene flow between the populations. This isn't a case of rare hybridization events producing sterile offspring like mules. The genetic contribution could only have persisted if the hybrid offspring were fertile and successfully reproducing, female hybrids passing on Neanderthal genes to their children, those children passing them on to the next generation after generation, until we reach modern populations still carrying those genetic signatures. The Y chromosome evidence is interesting because it shows the limitations and complexities of interbreeding. The absence of Neanderthal Y chromosomes in modern populations suggests that male hybrids might have had fertility problems or that there was strong selection against Neanderthal Y chromosomes. But this doesn't negate the evidence of successful interbreeding through other lineages. In fact, the Y chromosome pattern makes sense if we think about Neanderthals and modern humans as populations that were in the process of diverging but hadn't fully speciated yet. Some genetic incompatibilities might have been developing, like the incompatibility between Neanderthal Y chromosomes and modern human autosomal genes. But overall, genetic compatibility was still high enough that most hybrid offspring were viable and fertile. This kind of pattern, partial genetic incompatibility alongside overall ability to interbreed, is exactly what we'd expect to see in populations that had been separated long enough to start diverging, but not long enough to become completely reproductively isolated. It's an intermediate stage in the speciation process. If we found this pattern in any other species, in populations of birds or mammals or plants, we'd probably classify them as subspecies or as populations in the process of speciating. We might not classify them as fully separate species. The fact that we do classify Neanderthals as a separate species seems to be more about historical inertia than about applying consistent biological criteria. The original classification of Neanderthals as Homo neanderthalensis, a separate species, was made in the 1800s based purely on morphology. Researchers at the time saw the distinctive Neanderthal skull features and assumed these represented a different, more primitive species. This was before we understood genetics, before we knew about DNA, before we had ways to directly test whether populations could interbreed. Now we have all this additional information. We know they could interbreed successfully. We know their DNA differs from ours by less than 0.1%. We know they had sophisticated cognitive abilities. Shouldn't we be willing to revise the classification in light of new evidence? The resistance to reclassification seems to come partly from tradition. We've called them Homo neanderthalensis for over a century and a half. Changing that feels like overturning established science, but science is supposed to update its conclusions when new evidence comes in. That's how science works. There's also perhaps some reluctance to give up the narrative of Neanderthals as this separate, extinct species that we replaced. There's something compelling about that story. It fits into broader narratives about human evolution, about modern humans as the successful survivors who outlasted our evolutionary cousins. But if Neanderthals weren't really a separate species, if they were just a divergent population of Homo sapiens that got assimilated through interbreeding, that changes the story. It makes human evolution less about replacement and more about mixing, less about one superior form replacing inferior ones and more about populations meeting, mixing and contributing to the modern human gene pool. That's a more complex story. It's messier. It doesn't have clear winners and losers, but it's probably more accurate to what actually happened. The genetic evidence really doesn't leave much room for doubt about the interbreeding. The question is just whether we're willing to follow that evidence to its logical conclusion about species classification. Some researchers argue that we should keep Neanderthals classified as a separate species even if they could interbreed with modern humans because the morphological differences are so pronounced. But this seems like letting morphology trump genetics and reproductive compatibility. It's prioritizing how they looked over whether they could actually produce fertile offspring together. The biological species concept, which is what most people default to when thinking about species, specifically defines species by their ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. By that standard, populations that can interbreed successfully belong to the same species. Neanderthals and early modern humans could interbreed successfully, therefore they should be the same species. You can argue that the biological species concept has limitations. It does. It doesn't work well for asexual organisms. It doesn't work well for organisms that are separated geographically and never have the opportunity to interbreed. But in this case, we're not talking about hypothetical ability to interbreed. We're talking about actual documented interbreeding that occurred and left genetic traces that persist to this day. The morphological species concept, which classifies organisms based on physical characteristics, would support keeping Neanderthals separate. They do look distinctly different in skeletal features, but most modern species concepts have moved away from relying purely on morphology because we recognize that physical appearance can be misleading about actual biological relationships. Cryptic species can look identical but be reproductively isolated. Polymorphic species can look very different but still be able to interbreed. Morphology is a useful character for initial sorting but not definitive for species boundaries. The genetic species concept, which looks at genetic differentiation and gene flow, would actually support grouping Neanderthals with modern humans as one species with geographic variation. The amount of genetic differentiation between Neanderthal and modern human populations is less than we see between some populations that are unambiguously classified as the same species, and we have direct evidence of gene flow between the populations. That's pretty strong evidence for conspecific status. The ecological species concept looks at whether populations occupy distinct ecological niches. Neanderthals and early modern humans in Europe seem to have had largely overlapping ecological niches. Both were large game hunters. Both used similar environmental resources. Both occupied similar habitats. There's not a clear ecological separation that would support species-level distinction. Really, the main argument for keeping them separate seems to be morphological distinctiveness and historical precedent, but those seem like weak reasons when balanced against genetic evidence of successful interbreeding, behavioral evidence of similar cognitive capacities, and ecological evidence of similar adaptations. The presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern populations tells us something important about the nature of their interactions with early modern humans. This wasn't just a case of occasional hybridization at the margins of their ranges. The genetic contribution is widespread across modern populations outside Africa. It's found in Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, basically everyone whose ancestors left Africa. The distribution pattern suggests that the main interbreeding events happened relatively early in the modern human expansion out of Africa, probably in the Middle East region where the populations first encountered each other. The Neanderthal genetic contribution then spread as modern human populations expanded across Eurasia and eventually to the Americas and Pacific. Some populations have slightly higher percentages of Neanderthal DNA than others. East Asians tend to have slightly more Neanderthal ancestry than Europeans, for example. This might reflect additional interbreeding events as modern humans expanded into Asia, or it might reflect different demographic histories that preserved or reduced Neanderthal genetic contributions in different populations. What's clear is that the interbreeding was significant enough and successful enough that millions of years later, billions of people carry genetic sequences that came from Neanderthal ancestors. That's a lasting legacy. It's not some trivial footnote in human evolution. It's a central part of the story of how modern human populations developed. Some of the Neanderthal genes that persist in modern populations have been shown to have functional effects. They're not just neutral genetic baggage. Some Neanderthal gene variants affect immune system function. This makes sense because Neanderthals had been in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd adapted to local pathogens. When modern humans moved into these regions, acquiring immune system genes from the local Neanderthal populations would have been advantageous. Other Neanderthal gene variants affect skin and hair characteristics. Again, this makes sense as local adaptation. Neanderthals had adapted to the UV levels and climate conditions of Eurasia. These adaptations would have been useful for modern humans settling in the same regions. Rather than waiting for these adaptations to evolve independently, modern humans could acquire them through interbreeding. There's also evidence that some Neanderthal genes affect metabolism and fat storage. These might have been adaptations to Ice Age conditions and seasonal food availability in northern latitudes. Acquiring these genes through interbreeding would have helped modern humans adapt to challenging northern environments more quickly. Not all Neanderthal genetic contributions were beneficial, though. Some regions of the genome are depleted of Neanderthal ancestry in modern populations. This suggests that natural selection acted against some Neanderthal gene variants. They either reduced fitness or were incompatible with the modern human genetic background. Male fertility seems to have been particularly affected. The absence of Neanderthal Y chromosomes and the depletion of Neanderthal ancestry on the X chromosome suggest that male hybrids might have had reduced fertility. This could have been due to genetic incompatibilities between Neanderthal and modern human versions of genes important for male reproduction. Even with these incompatibilities, the overall picture is one of successful genetic mixing. Most of the Neanderthal genome could combine with the modern human genome without causing problems. The hybrids were viable and fertile enough to have children who had children, generation after generation. That's successful interbreeding by any reasonable biological standard. The timeline of Neanderthal decline and disappearance correlates closely with modern human expansion into Europe. This has led to debates about what role modern humans played in Neanderthal extinction. Some researchers favour a competitive replacement model where modern humans outcompeted Neanderthals for resources. Others favour models emphasising assimilation through interbreeding. The genetic evidence actually supports both processes happening simultaneously. There was definitely interbreeding and genetic assimilation. Neanderthal genes flowed into the expanding modern human population, but Neanderthal populations as distinct entities did disappear. By 40,000 years ago, we stopped finding archaeological sites that have the distinctive Neanderthal material culture. So what happened? Probably a combination of factors. Small Neanderthal population sizes meant they were vulnerable to demographic fluctuations. Even small decreases in birth rates or increases in death rates could push populations toward extinction. Competition with modern humans for resources could have contributed to demographic stress. Climate change during this period was also significant. The last ice age was characterized by rapid climate fluctuations. Neanderthal populations might have been struggling to adapt to these changing conditions even before modern humans arrived. The additional pressure from modern human competition could have been the final straw. Interbreeding itself might have contributed to Neanderthal demographic decline. If male hybrids had reduced fertility, every Neanderthal male who had children with a modern human female would have produced fewer fertile descendants than if he'd had children with a Neanderthal female. Over generations, this could drain reproductive potential from small Neanderthal populations. Modern human populations, being much larger, could absorb these fertility costs without major demographic consequences. But for Neanderthals already in small scattered populations, the costs could have been significant. It's a grim irony if interbreeding, which gave modern humans valuable genetic adaptations, also contributed to Neanderthal extinction. The geographic pattern of Neanderthal disappearance shows them retreating to refugia, isolated pockets where they persisted longer. The evidence from northern Germany showing a concentration of late Neanderthal sites suggests this might have been one such refugium. As modern humans expanded through Europe, Neanderthal populations might have been pushed into these marginal areas. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to extinction through random demographic events. A harsh winter, a disease outbreak, a hunting accident that kills several key individuals, any of these could push a small population past the point of recovery. The last Neanderthal populations might have winked out not through any dramatic confrontation with modern humans, but through the quiet accumulation of random misfortunes. Or the final populations might have been assimilated completely through interbreeding. If the last few dozen Neanderthals all had children with modern human partners, their distinctive morphology and culture would disappear even though their genes would persist. This might be the most likely scenario for at least some of the last Neanderthal populations. What's clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals as a distinct population were gone, but their genetic legacy persisted in the modern human populations that had absorbed them. In that sense, they didn't go entirely extinct, they were assimilated. Their genes, their adaptations, became part of the modern human gene pool. This raises interesting questions about what extinction even means for populations that can interbreed with other populations. If your genes persist, even though your distinct population identity disappears, is that extinction or assimilation? Biologically, genes are what matters for evolution. From that perspective, Neanderthals didn't go entirely extinct, they became part of us. Culturally, and as a distinct population, yes, they went extinct. We no longer have people who identify as Neanderthals or maintain Neanderthal cultural traditions. The distinctive Neanderthal morphology is gone, but genetically they're still here, in the billions of people who carry fragments of Neanderthal DNA. This mixing of populations and genetic assimilation might be more common in human evolution than we've traditionally recognized. The old model of human evolution had distinct species evolving in isolation, and then one species replacing all the others. The new model emerging from genetic data is messier. It involves multiple populations diverging and then coming back into contact, mixing, exchanging genes. Neanderthals aren't the only example. Denisovans, another archaic human population known primarily from genetic evidence, also interbred with modern humans. Their genetic contribution is highest in some Pacific populations, but is found more broadly across Asia and Oceania. There might have been other archaic populations that mixed with modern humans, but left fewer genetic traces or that we haven't identified yet. Human evolution looks less like a tree with separate branches and more like a braided stream with channels separating and rejoining. Populations diverged as they adapted to different environments but maintained enough genetic compatibility that they could exchange genes when they came back into contact. This created a complex web of relationships rather than clean species boundaries. The implications of this for how we understand human diversity and human evolution are profound. If populations could diverge significantly in morphology while maintaining ability to interbreed, that suggests morphological diversity doesn't necessarily map onto reproductive isolation. We might be overestimating how different some fossil populations were from each other based on skeletal differences. This matters for understanding the whole human fossil record. We have lots of fossil specimens that show morphological variation. Traditionally, paleontologists have tended to split these into different species based on morphological differences. But if we apply the same standards we use for living species, where we recognize that substantial morphological variation can exist within species, we might need to lump some of these fossils together rather than splitting them. The species problem in paleontology has always been tricky because we can't directly test reproductive compatibility with fossils. We have to infer species boundaries from morphology and sometimes from genetic data if we can extract it. But the Neanderthal case shows that morphologically distinct populations might still be able to interbreed successfully. This should make us more cautious about assuming morphological distinctiveness equals separate species status. Looking at modern human populations, we see morphological variation that would probably have been classified as separate species if we only had fossil skeletons to work with. The robust features of some populations versus the more gracile features of others. Variations in cranial shape, facial projection, body proportions. If we found these as fossils without the genetic and behavioral evidence showing they're all one species, we might split them into multiple species. The Neanderthal and modern human case suggests we should apply this same logic to fossil populations unless we have strong evidence that populations were reproductively isolated. We should probably err on the side of lumping rather than splitting. Morphological variation might reflect geographic adaptation and genetic drift within species rather than speciation. This revised understanding of human evolution has implications for how we think about human nature and human diversity. The old replacement model implicitly suggested that modern humans were somehow special or superior, having completely replaced other human forms. The new model of mixing and assimilation suggests instead that modern humans benefited from incorporating genetic diversity from other populations. We're not a pure lineage that evolved in isolation. We're a mix. We carry genes from Neanderthals, from Denisovans, possibly from other archaic populations we haven't fully characterized yet. This genetic mixing might have been advantageous. It might have given us access to adaptations that had evolved in other populations over hundreds of thousands of years. Rather than having to evolve all our own adaptations to Eurasian environments from scratch, modern humans could borrow adaptations through interbreeding. This might have accelerated our ability to colonize diverse environments worldwide. The Neanderthal genes for immune function, for skin and hair characteristics, for metabolism. These could have helped modern human populations adapt to Eurasia more quickly. This makes the expansion of modern humans look less like superior beings conquering the world and more like populations adapting partly through incorporating local adaptations from populations already established in those regions. It's a more humble narrative, but it's probably more accurate. It also changes how we should think about the relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals, not as separate species with one replacing the other, but as closely related populations that mixed when they met. The boundary between them was permeable. They could have children together. Those children could have children. The genetic boundary that defines species wasn't there or was at most incomplete. This makes the question of whether Neanderthals were the same species as us less about finding a definitive yes or no answer, and more about recognizing that species boundaries can be fuzzy, especially for populations in the process of diverging. Maybe the right answer is that Neanderthals and modern humans were in an intermediate state, diverged enough to have distinct morphology and culture, but not diverged enough to be fully reproductively isolated. If we need to force them into a classification, calling them subspecies makes more sense than calling them separate species. Homo sapiens neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens sapiens as two subspecies of the same species would better reflect the biological reality of their relationship. They were variants of the same species adapted to different environments but still able to interbreed successfully. The cultural implications of this reclassification might seem minor, but they matter. If Neanderthals were a separate species that we replaced, that narrative can feed into ideas about human uniqueness and superiority. It can make it seem like there's something fundamentally special about modern Homo sapiens that allowed us to triumph over all other human forms. But if Neanderthals were just another population of Homo sapiens, the narrative changes. We didn't replace them, we absorbed them. They're literally part of us. This is a more inclusive narrative. It recognizes continuity rather than replacement. It acknowledges that modern human success came partly from incorporating diversity rather than from some inherent superiority. The behavioral evidence that Neanderthals had symbolic culture, art, burial rituals, all of this becomes less surprising in this framework. Of course they had these capabilities. They were humans, not a different species, but our direct ancestors and cousins. The cognitive abilities that enabled symbolic behavior weren't unique to one population. They were part of the shared heritage of late Pleistocene Homo sapiens populations across Africa and Eurasia. This doesn't mean there were no differences between populations. Clearly there were morphological differences. There were probably cultural differences in specifics, even if the broad cognitive capacities were similar. But these differences were variations within humanity rather than differences between species. The resistance to reclassifying Neanderthals as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis might stem partly from not wanting to give up the species name. Homo neanderthalensis has been used for so long that changing it feels like losing something, but scientific classification is supposed to reflect biological reality, not preserve traditional names for their own sake. If the biological evidence supports classifying them as a subspecies rather than a separate species, then that's what the classification should reflect. We've reclassified organisms before when new evidence warranted it. There's no reason Neanderthals should be exempt from this process. The genetic evidence will probably continue to accumulate. We're getting better at extracting and analysing ancient DNA. More Neanderthal genomes are being sequenced. More modern human genomes are being analysed for Neanderthal ancestry. This accumulating evidence will likely continue to support the interbreeding and mixing model. We might find evidence of additional archaic populations that mixed with modern humans. The Denisovan contribution is already established, but we only have a few actual Denisovan fossils. There might be other populations we know only from genetic traces they left in modern populations. Each one we find adds complexity to the story of human evolution. The picture emerging is one of a complex web of interactions between populations across Africa and Eurasia over hundreds of thousands of years. Populations diverged as they adapted to different environments. They came back into contact when climate changes shifted ranges or when expanding populations encountered each other. They exchanged genes and cultural innovations. This web of interactions created the genetic and cultural diversity we see in modern human populations. We're not the product of a single population evolving in isolation. We're the product of multiple populations mixing and exchanging genes over a long period. Our genome is a mosaic, incorporating contributions from different archaic populations. Understanding this complexity is important for understanding modern human genetic diversity. The variation we see between modern populations reflects not just recent evolutionary history, but also different patterns of mixing with archaic populations. The slightly higher Neanderthal ancestry in East Asians versus Europeans. The Denisovan ancestry in Pacific populations. These reflect ancient patterns of population interaction. This has medical implications too. Some Neanderthal gene variants that persist in modern populations affect disease susceptibility. Understanding which populations carry which Neanderthal variants and what effects those variants have could be relevant for understanding disease patterns and developing treatments. The Neanderthal contribution to our genome isn't just interesting history, it has ongoing biological relevance. The behavioral evidence from Neanderthal sites also continues to accumulate and become more sophisticated. New analytical techniques let us extract more information from archaeological sites. Better dating methods help us understand the timing of events. More sites are being discovered and excavated, especially in regions that haven't been intensively studied before. Each new site, each new analysis adds detail to our understanding of how Neanderthals lived and what they were capable of. The trend over the last few decades has been toward recognizing more behavioral sophistication in Neanderthals, not less. They use tools in more complex ways than we previously thought. Their sites show more evidence of planning and symbolic behavior. The gap between their capabilities and early modern human capabilities keeps shrinking as we learn more. If anything, the question now is not whether Neanderthals were cognitively capable of complex behavior, but why they went extinct if they were so capable. If they had symbolic culture, sophisticated technology, and successful adaptations to Ice Age environments, why did they disappear while modern humans survived and expanded? The answer probably lies in demographic factors more than cognitive ones. Small population sizes made them vulnerable. Fragmenting populations increased that vulnerability. Even if they were just as smart and just as capable as modern humans, bad demographic luck combined with climate stress and competition could have pushed them to extinction. The interbreeding with modern humans might have accelerated this, not because there was anything wrong with the hybrids, but because gene flow was asymmetric. More genes flowed from Neanderthals into the larger modern human population than vice versa. This could have drained genetic diversity and reproductive potential from small Neanderthal populations. It's similar to how small populations of endangered species today can be absorbed through hybridization with more common related species. The rarer species doesn't go completely extinct genetically, but its distinct identity disappears as individuals have offspring with the more common species. The genes persist in a mixed population, but the distinct population disappears. This might be the best way to understand Neanderthal extinction, not as complete extinction, but as assimilation through interbreeding combined with demographic collapse. The population disappeared, the culture disappeared, but the genes persisted in mixed populations that we now call modern humans. This makes us, modern humans, the inheritors of a complex evolutionary legacy. We carry genes from multiple populations. We inherited cultural innovations that might have originated in different populations. Human evolution wasn't a simple linear progression, from primitive to advanced. It was a web of populations diverging, mixing, competing, and exchanging both genes and ideas. Recognizing this complexity should make us think differently about human diversity. The variation we see in modern populations has deep roots. It reflects ancient population histories. It reflects mixing with archaic populations in some regions but not others. It reflects local adaptations that developed over hundreds of thousands of years. We're all modern Homo sapiens, but we're not all identical. We carry different mixes of ancestry from different ancient populations. We've inherited different adaptive variants. This diversity is part of what makes humanity successful as a species. It's not something to be minimized or ignored. The Neanderthal story, properly understood, is ultimately a story about human diversity and human adaptability, about populations finding their own solutions to environmental challenges, about populations meeting and mixing rather than one replacing all the others. About successful adaptations persisting through gene flow even when populations themselves disappear. It's a more nuanced story than simple replacement narratives. It requires us to think about speciation as a process with intermediate stages rather than as a binary state. It requires us to integrate evidence from morphology, genetics, and behavior rather than privileging any one type of evidence. And it requires us to revise long-held classifications when new evidence warrants it. The question of whether Neanderthals were the same species as us doesn't have a simple answer because species boundaries aren't always simple, but the weight of evidence suggests they were at most a divergent subspecies, not a fully separate species. They were human in every way that matters biologically, and they're still part of us today in the Neanderthal DNA that billions of people carry in their genomes.